Looking back, Africa shares a complicated history with Europe and the rest of the so-called superpowers. Tainted and colonization, the relations now are believed to have taken on a different form: cooperation, putting all continents on an equal footing. But the world we live in today is filled with change in the complex of foreign relations. You know the saying, no permanent enemies. So where is Ethiopia and Africa as a whole in this dynamic atmosphere? Hello and welcome to Diplomatic Insights. I'm Kidana Baina. Today we will be looking at where Ethiopia and Africa are at on the realm of diplomacy in the 21st century. Elaborating this for us today is Ambassador Tiruneh Zena, a former ambassador of Ethiopia to the European Union and the United Nations, a long-serving career diplomat who has Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia for more than 3 decades. Do stay with us. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for availing yourself and giving us the time and space to conduct this interview.
Thank you very much for having me also on this very important issue.
All right. Well, through the ages, Ethiopia's diplomacy has been directed towards different aims. Friends have changed and foes have been reconciled. We've been able to sustain our friendship with different countries like Cuba, and at some point we were considered the West's ally in its fight against terrorism. And even one of the designations of Addis Ababa, that is the capital of Ethiopia, is the diplomatic hub of Africa. And so have we been able to use our diplomatic potential to its fullest?
Yes, we did. We changed positions. Sometimes we worked with the Western countries and supported by the Western governments. And in other time we went to the East and we were supported by Eastern countries. And but always we have been center of African politics. This is our hallmark. There was no time Ethiopia was sidelined when it comes to the African issue, or there was no time when African countries sort of neglected Ethiopian issue. Africans, I could say, stood with Ethiopia. They supported us. We supported them. That is what it is.
So throughout the ages now, we've seen power get polarized. There was the Cold War, we saw it become bipolar, and then we saw it become unipolar, and now we're at where people think we're in a multipolar system. Now you've served at both the EU and the UN, so let me ask you, where can we place Ethiopia in that system? Ethiopia's, how can I put it, Ethiopia's diplomacy or maybe foreign relations, how has it evolved with the growing multipolar system of the world? Where do we place our country?
That's a very important question. I wrote a lot on a newspaper, and I also expressed my concern about the changing world and the risk that would accompany it. Because when things change, change doesn't come simply easily. It comes with risks, it comes with danger, So I always tried to sensitize my government, even after I was retired, on this issue, because the world is changing very much these days. It has never changed the way it is today. After the war, it was a bipolar world. It was in the East, it was the Soviet Union. In the West, it was the United States, which two of them with their own interests, with their own allies, And those of us in the middle, we know where to go, When we are not happy with the West, we go to the West. When we are not happy with the East, we go to the West, We played that kind of theater Of course, Ethiopia did. You know, we were with the United States, and during in 1960s, when the Somali invaded us, the West neglected us, the United States especially, who used to provide us with armament, refused to give us anything to support us. And Somalia was, you know, armed to the teeth. So we were, had it not been for the Soviet Union and its assistance, we simply could have crumbled, you know. So we went to the East and saved our independence. That's what we did then, you know, when it was bipolar world. Today, that is, I don't think that will work, because today there is no, you know, this is a world where there is multiple powers. So in this kind of situation, we must be very clever. We must be very, how could I say, very fast in reading the moves in the world. Second point is, the second point is not in such a situation when things are changing very fast, when there is uncertainty, which is very dangerous thing in international politics, you know. If you are certain of certain thing, you can calculate, you can move. But when there is uncertainty, it is very difficult. There is uncertainty these days. So how can we save yourself in such a situation for such uncertain condition? There are one very important thing. You have to be strong yourself on your own. You have to have strong economy, which I always said, especially self-sufficiency in basic items.
All right. So you phrased an important thing where we need to be strong internally, but you know the West have this tendency kind of to move together. So let's bring it to our continent. And has Ethiopia been able to maintain a permanent friendship or partnership with African countries? Would you say, you know, countries that we're on more or less, for lack of better terms, on equal footing with? Because the West have their own agenda, their own propaganda, their own set of narratives, and we would think that African countries are closer to our cause or closer to our ideologies, so to speak. So has Ethiopia been able to maintain a strong diplomatic relationship with African countries?
That's also a very good question. We tried. Let me say, still we. So I'm a pensioner. You know, we tried, and we were successful in many instances. For example, we succeeded in pulling the headquarters of Africa to be in Ethiopia. This is the highest success, number one. After that, we succeeded to maintain balanced relation when African countries divided among themselves. There is division between African countries, Western African countries, Eastern African countries, Northern African countries. We try to maintain a balance, you know. We played a good role in that. So this is a good aspect or a good action we took during since the establishment of AU. But if you ask me, are you satisfied with the action the Ethiopian government has taken in bringing the Africans together, in playing, you know, the African politics at world stage? Not only in Africa, there are black people in the United States. There are black people in Brazil. You know that 60% of the Brazilian population are colored, black African descent people. You know, this is a power international, especially nowadays. We didn't have that much insight, to go that far, to play the Pan-African or Pan-African politics, or to, or even in mobilizing the colored African people who consider Ethiopia as their cultural base, the only country that remained from the colonialism, maintained its independence and protected their culture. All the other culture is diluted with Western, its language. We maintained it. We are an example. Black people wants us to roll the exemplary role, and to bring them together, to play, how could I say, a role of a paternal role, sort of. But we didn't do it because of our weakness, internal weakness, economic weakness, political weakness. We didn't do what is expected of us. I hope we could do now.
Okay, that being said, this ideological, paternal sort of role that Ethiopia is expected to play or has played in terms of Pan-Africanism, but coming to the modern world, would this be a right statement to make? Instead of lining up with Ethiopia, other African countries have interests greater than, the idealistic notion of Pan-Africanism. So for them to align with other powers, let's say Western powers, instead of Ethiopia's interests. Is that a right statement to make? Is that what's happening?
It's not what is happening, unfortunately. But, there was movement at initial stage to, to make Africa really independent. There were not only Ethiopia, there were leaders like Nkrumah, leaders like Bambela, leaders like Patrice Lumumba, who wanted to play the Africanist role and make African independent, truly independent. If you simply get your independence, nominal, let me say, without economic power, without unity, it will be simply nominal. It will not be true independence. So that was such a concept. But what the West did after 1960s, when they gave independence to African, to their colonies, some of the leaders who came after independence were really their making, They were not African nationalists. They were not Pan-Africanists. They were not far-sighted people who wanted to bring Africa, black Africa, to the world stage. They who tried to, they nipped in the bud. They destroyed them, like Nkrumah, like Bembela, like Patrice Lumumba, and brought their lackeys. So it was difficult for countries like Ethiopia or others to bring all the African people together, because there have been a force working against that, and a strong force. That force is still working today. You see, probably some countries standing against Ethiopia, with Western countries. Let me be frank. That is because they made it. They worked on it. They are there. From the very beginning. The Bambelas, the Nkrumahs, the Patrice Lumumbas, they never succeeded. They never maintained their power. They destroyed them. They brought their lackeys. And still there are such countries, you know. But it will grow. The young people will come. The young people will realize they will be more conscious than we were, more independent. Africa will not be the same Africa which was 20, 30 years ago. It will be different. The world is changing. And, you know, there are still Africans who simply who don't understand how the world is moving, how the world is changing. They are still there, you know.
Yeah, speaking of Africa, and since you've brought up Europe and Africa, we've looked at Ethiopia and Ethiopia's relations with Africa, but looking at it on a wider arena now, Africa has a, one would say, sort of tainted history with Europe. Both human and material resources have been exploited, but now we're assuming that we're on equal footing in our relations with Europe. So as a continent, how do you fit in Africa in relations of EU countries, for instance, or in general the United Nations? But let's start with European countries.
While in Africa, Africa is in disadvantaged position. Let us admit that first of all, because Africa's human resources were depleted through slave trade. The most able-bodied were, you know, taken away, you know, to serve as slaves, to work in other society, to work for other people. They made prosperous United States. They worked for companies which collected enough capital to carry out industrial revolution. It is a slave trade. It is a slave trade which helped them to be so rich to carry out industrial revolution. You know, that happened at the expense of Africa, isn't it? Human resources were depleted. After that, natural resources continue to be depleted by colonialism. When they are tired of slave trade, they shifted into colonialism. And they controlled the natural resource of Africa. You know, Africa has never been on its own for 2 centuries or more. So you don't expect Africa to be on equal footing with Europeans. But that does not mean we simply should submit, you know, and play the role we used to play. You young people especially, you know, time has come to fight back, you know, to tell to them that it is time for us to control our own resources, to organize our own society. We don't need guidance from here and there to go on our own way. And it is time for us to be respected. It is time for us to be treated as equals, you know. We should be voicing that because, you know, after slavery, after colonialism, after neo-colonialism, it is evolving, or we are evolving. We should be different, you know. We should not remain where we were during the time of slavery or colonialism or neo-colonialism. We should fight for equality. And that is, what you should play, what the young people especially should be playing for your equality, for your honor, to bring Africa at equal footing as the world stage.
Okay, so now let's make the scope wider. And now since we're talking about representation, let's go to the United Nations. So what does Africa's representation look like in the United Nations?
Well, Africa's representation, you know, people don't understand or lack to understand what is the United Nations. United Nations is an organization which were set up by victorious powers. You know, the United States, Great Britain, Russia, and those big powers, they defeated Nazi Germany and Japan, and they set up an organization which they considered will protect their interest and will maintain their hegemony over the world. You know, this is what happened after the Second World War. And the United Nations is one of the organizations which they created after the war. You know, you must be thinking about the Security Council, where the five of them, one of them, everything will be simply remain unchanged, you know, because they made it in such a way that no one could change anything without their what's consent, their consent, you know. The P5 are there, you know, and Africa is not represented, I know. Latin America is not represented, I know. Even in Europe, look, Germany is the biggest economic power, but it is not Germany that is represented in the Security Council. Japan is the second biggest or the third biggest economy now, but Japan is not there. Why? They were defeated, and we were not there as an independent power. Only Ethiopia and Liberia and a few other countries were there. When they set up this organization. So our representation remains the way it was when it was set up after the war. Of course, it is changing now because of economic reasons. You know, when the war ended, the United States alone controlled 60% of the world GNP. 60%. Today it is 22%, you know. So the others are coming, you know. When economic status change, many other things will change. It is evolving. It is evolving world. It is changing world. That's why, you know, today the world is very unstable, you know. Others are coming up. They are not satisfied the way the world is organized, the way the world is being led.
Okay, so in this, you know, contemporary global reality that you just mentioned, I mean, Africa not having a permanent seat, having to ask for a permanent seat in the 21st century for the UN Security Council, I mean, what does it say, first of all, about where we're going in terms of our global reality? And, well, I'll ask you the second question later on, but can Africa survive outside of these, so to say, organizations such as the UN or without the EU? I mean, we're not members of the EU, but can we survive without interacting with the European Union if we're at such a disadvantage?
Well, it is, you know, the world will never be, you know, kind of society where simply, you know, what it was some 200 or 300 years ago, where Africa worked on its own, where Europe was just united among themselves, or the United States was probably a known country. It will never happen. The world is integrated economically and politically, but what is making the world unstable is there are new forces coming up who fight or who are not satisfied with the status quo. That means they will fight for more power, okay, more status, okay, but they will not leave say, the organization like the United Nations and go somewhere, come back to Africa and set up their own. This will never happen.
All right. So one final question before we go is the African Union, as you say, is controlled by the West if it's funded by the West. So is there any way that Africa could carry its own burden in terms of funding the AU and finally freeing itself from that, what can we call it, pressure? Because we cannot be united in the AU as long as there's a Western power involved, because there will still be influence and there will still be dominance of some powers over other African countries. So my final question is there a way that Africa finally free themselves of the metaphorical shackle of the West and make the African Union truly for Africans?
Yes, we could, we can. We are rich. This is the second most biggest continent, very rich continent. You know, in 2050, they are saying 1 in 4 person in the world will be an African. Okay, probably countries like Nigeria will be number 1 or number 2 richest country in the world. Okay, the world is evolving. The world is changing. But there are there are many problems which I want to warn you. It will not be strong. It will not be what we hoped for, unless otherwise we control corruption in Africa. You know, Africa is very rich, as I said. Africa has lot of enormous resources. But where does money go? To Europe. Why does it go? Because our leaders are corrupt. You know, they don't want to put their money in their own country because they don't have trust in their own people. Where do they put? In Geneva. So how can we be independent and strong, led by such a kind of people? First and foremost, we have to get rid of such leaders. We have to find leaders, nationalist leaders, patriotic leaders, and we need to set up a government on friendship and things like that, but on meritocracy. So you have to start fighting at home, first of all, if you want to act equally with others in the world stage. Am I clear? And fortunately, in Ethiopia, we have patriots in the country. Of course, not all. We have people who do not always work for money, but for honor also. But it is still that. Ethiopia should be an example. We need to be different. We should say, well, here, this is African culture, this is the way we should behave, and here we are, please follow us, you know. So we should present ourselves as template, you know. And we should work.
Okay. Well, Ambassador, thank you very much for your insights and your thoughts on the matter.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'm very happy to share my little experience and opinion with you young people. Thank you very much.
Well, on that note, today's diplomatic insight comes to an end. We've looked at where Ethiopia and Africa in general are at in the realm of diplomacy in the 21st century. I've had a good stay with Ambassador Tiruneh Zena. I was Kirana Baina leading the program, and until next time.